I was half asleep when the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence of the night, jerking me awake. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, blinking against the sudden light, and saw his phone glowing on the nightstand. He stirred, groaning, reaching for it, and I froze, a strange unease tightening in my chest. "Who's calling at this hour?" I mumbled, my voice hushed more to myself than to him. He answered, still half asleep, and I noticed the quick exchange, the hurried words, the slight tension creeping into his voice. Something about the way he spoke, the sharpness that wasn't there during the day, made my stomach twist. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it could be work, a friend, anything. But the feeling lingered, gnawing quietly at the back of my mind. A few minutes later, he hung up and turned toward me, rubbing his eyes. "It was just a client issue," he said, attempting a reassuring smile. "Nothing to worry about." I nodded, but sleep no longer seemed possible. My mind raced, replaying the tone of his voice, the words I thought I had heard. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was a simple, late-night call. But there was a tug of curiosity I couldn't ignore. Then I saw the notification on his phone, a series of messages, the kind that didn't belong to work. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the device, torn between trust and fear. My heart pounded, my mind warning me that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. But something in me, a mixture of intuition and dread, compelled me to look. The screen lit up, revealing messages that made my blood run cold. Casual, intimate exchanges, words of affection that weren't meant for me. Dates, plans, small jokes, details I knew nothing about. The realization hit me slowly, painfully, like the slow drip of water on stone. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a fleeting interaction. This was something deliberate, hidden, and ongoing. I sank back against the headboard, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced through possibilities, explanations, denials I could cling to, but the evidence was clear. Each message was a small blow, each notification a confirmation of the betrayal I hadn't wanted to imagine. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, disbelief, fear, and an almost paralytic sadness. How long had this been happening? How many times had he hidden the truth behind polite words, careful smiles, and the routines of everyday life? The room felt smaller, the shadows longer. As I sat there in the dark, staring at a phone that had changed everything, I thought about confronting him immediately. But something stopped me. The shock was too sharp, my voice too unsteady. I needed clarity, a plan, and perhaps most importantly, I needed to understand the full scope before I let the confrontation erupt. I tucked the phone back, heart still racing, and tried to imagine the morning. How could I face him, act normal, and yet know what I now knew? Sleep finally came, fitful and uneasy, shadowed by the knowledge that our life, the one we had built together, had been fractured in a single moment by a glowing screen and a string of hidden messages. The house was silent, but in my mind, every word echoed. The trust I had taken for granted felt fragile, delicate, and irreparably altered. Morning brought light, but not relief. I watched him move around, the same gestures, the same routines, but I couldn't see him the same way. Every smile, every casual conversation carried the weight of last night's discovery. The messages hovered in my mind, unspoken but unshakable. I realized then that nothing would ever feel normal again. The knowledge of his hidden life, the intimacy with someone else, and the deliberate secrecy had shifted everything. Our home, our conversations, our trust, all had changed with that phone ringing at midnight. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the next steps I took would define not just the future of our marriage, but the very sense of who I was, and how I allowed myself to be treated. The shock was only the beginning. What came next would test patience, courage, and my understanding of love in ways I had never imagined. And as I sat there in the quiet, staring at the phone now resting innocuously on the nightstand, I felt a resolve begin to form, quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. In the days that followed, our home was filled with the quiet tension of unspoken truths. He moved about as if nothing had happened, smiling in the morning, sharing small updates about work and errands, completely unaware or perhaps willfully ignoring that I now carried knowledge that could change everything. And I, in turn, learned to navigate the space between observation and action, patience and confrontation. I spent hours replaying the messages in my mind, analyzing the tone, the timing, the content. Each detail mattered, each word a clue to the scope of what had been hidden from me. But alongside the shock and hurt, there was a quiet determination forming. I realized that whatever steps I took next, I needed clarity, control, and a plan that would protect not just my emotions, but my dignity. Our marriage, up to that point, had been quiet in its routines but steady in its comforts. He had always been dependable, organized, and seemingly attentive. I had built my life around these small assurances: the shared meals, the Sunday markets, the late-night conversations when the world outside fell silent. We weren't perfect, of course. There were disagreements, small irritations, and moments of miscommunication, but trust had been our bedrock. Or at least, I had believed it to be. The discovery forced me to confront not only his hidden actions, but also my own assumptions. I had devoted myself to this marriage, to supporting him through work, illness, and everyday struggles. I had forgone opportunities, neglected personal pursuits, and sacrificed freely, believing that the commitment and loyalty we shared were mutual. And yet, there, in the glow of his phone, I saw that loyalty was one-sided, fragile, and perhaps never fully returned. In the mornings, I went through the motions of daily life with precision, preparing breakfast, organizing our schedules, attending to household tasks. I wanted to maintain a sense of normalcy, if only to observe him, to gauge whether he would show signs of guilt, defensiveness, or remorse. But outward calm did little to ease the storm inside. Every smile from him, every casual remark, was a reminder of the deception, a whisper that nothing was truly as I had believed. At the same time, I reflected on my own needs, my own sense of self-worth. The messages had stripped away more than trust. They forced me to consider the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, and whether I was complicit in accepting less than I deserved. There were moments of anger so sharp it made my hands tremble, and moments of sorrow so deep that tears came unbidden as I sat quietly in the living room, replaying years of shared experiences and wondering which were genuine and which had been shadowed by lies. I began keeping a subtle record, not to prove anything to him, but to ensure I understood the full scope of the situation. Dates, times, conversations, hints of inconsistencies in his stories, all of it I noted, quietly, carefully. This wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of preparation, a way to protect myself and to make sure that when I confronted him, I would do so with clarity, composure, and evidence. At the same time, I observed the patterns of his daily life: phone habits, sudden disappearances, excuses for late nights or missed calls. I realized that some behaviors I had dismissed in the past now carried a new weight of meaning. Where once I might have shrugged or assumed a benign explanation, I now examined actions with scrutiny, aware that deceit had found a foothold. But it wasn't all surveillance and suspicion. I also needed to preserve my own mental and emotional health. I began carving out quiet moments: early mornings in the garden, walks around the neighborhood, even journaling at night to process the swelling emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and grief all demanded recognition. And I allowed myself these private spaces to feel, reflect, and begin to regain a sense of agency. Conversations with friends became careful, cautious. I couldn't reveal the full truth, not yet, but I sought perspectives on trust, relationships, and personal boundaries. I learned to listen without judgment, to ask questions that helped me weigh options, and to quietly reinforce my understanding that while love and marriage could be profound, they should not be blind to respect and honesty. Meanwhile, my husband's behavior remained outwardly unchanged. There were moments when I caught him glancing at me with curiosity, perhaps sensing a subtle shift in my demeanor, but he never questioned it. And in that silence, a quiet power began to emerge, an understanding that I was no longer simply a passive participant in our life together. I was observing, analyzing, preparing, and waiting for the right moment to reclaim clarity and control over the situation. I also began reflecting on the past, small instances that, in hindsight, had hinted at secrets: missed calls, unexplained messages, sudden changes in routine. Each memory, once insignificant, now carried a new weight. I realized that this revelation was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern I had subconsciously noticed but chosen to overlook. And now, armed with awareness, I could no longer ignore it. In these weeks, I noticed how deeply betrayal reshapes daily life. The mundane sharing breakfast, walking to the store, sitting in the living room became infused with tension. Every gesture, every word carried the potential for duplicity or truth. I learned to navigate this new reality with precision, maintaining civility while holding an inner vigilance that was both exhausting and empowering, and through it all, a quiet determination grew within me. I knew that when the time came to confront him, it would not be in the heat of anger or panic. It would be deliberate, measured, and undeniable. I would face the truth, present the evidence, and demand clarity not for the sake of punishment, but for the sake of reclaiming control over my life, my home, and my sense of self. In the evenings, after he went to bed, I would sit quietly, replaying scenarios, imagining conversations, and planning the steps I would need to take. Each message, each small detail, became a piece of a larger puzzle, and slowly, a sense of empowerment replaced some of the initial shock. I understood that knowledge, painful as it was now my ally. By the end of the second week, I could see subtle changes in myself. I moved with more caution, spoke with more deliberation, and observed without reacting impulsively. The betrayal had forced a transformation in me, sharpening my instincts, strengthening my resolve, and clarifying what I would and would not accept. I realized that the messages had done more than expose deceit. They had awakened a deeper understanding of my own worth, my boundaries, and my capacity to act decisively when the time came. And though life continued in its ordinary rhythms, work, errands, meals, conversations, the undercurrent of tension and awareness remained. I knew the moment of revelation, the confrontation that would inevitably come, was approaching. But in the meantime, I carried a quiet, deliberate patience, observing, reflecting, and preparing, not just for confrontation, but for the reclamation of clarity, dignity, and control over the life I had built and deserved. The tension between us became almost tangible. He moved through the house as if nothing had changed, but I could sense the subtle shifts: the way he avoided eye contact at certain times, the slight hesitation when he spoke, the carefulness in his tone. And yet, he didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't try to justify. He simply acted as if our home, our life together, was untouched by the reality I now carried in my heart. I found myself walking a delicate line. I needed to maintain normalcy, to preserve appearances, but I also needed to test the limits, to see whether he would reveal anything more or continue to rely on silence as a shield. Every small interaction became a minefield. A casual question about his day, a comment about plans, or even a glance at the phone could trigger a defensive response or worse, reveal cracks in his carefully maintained facade. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, he came into the kitchen. He smiled, but there was a slight tension in his shoulders that I hadn't noticed before. "Long day?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral. He shrugged. "Same as always," he said, but the truth was in the hesitation, the tiny pause before he responded. I noticed it instantly. I had spent weeks observing patterns, noting inconsistencies, and now I could read him like a book. The control in our home was subtly shifting. While he might have assumed I was unaware, I had become acutely aware of the lies, the omissions, and the careful navigation he relied on to maintain appearances. I began testing him in small ways. A question about a friend he mentioned, a reference to a place he claimed to visit, nothing accusatory, just probing. I watched his reactions, the micro expressions, the slight defensiveness, the way he diverted conversations. Each moment was a small revelation, a confirmation of patterns I had already suspected. At the same time, I felt a constant internal struggle. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand explanations and hold him accountable. But another part understood that timing was everything. Any rash action could backfire, could allow him to manipulate the narrative or obscure the truth further. I had to remain calm, deliberate, and patient, letting him reveal himself through behavior while I maintained control of my own response. There were moments when the emotional pressure was nearly unbearable. I would find myself staring at his phone when he was distracted, my fingers itching to uncover every secret. I battled an overwhelming mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. And yet I reminded myself that this was not the moment for impulsive action. Every move had to be calculated. The power dynamic, once comfortably in his favor, was beginning to tilt quietly, almost imperceptibly toward me. Social situations added another layer of complexity. Friends or family visits became exercises in composure. I learned to mask the storm inside, to smile, converse, and play the part of normalcy, all while quietly observing him and his interactions. Each word, each glance, each subtle gesture became a piece of the puzzle. The manipulation, the silence, the half-truths all were now visible to me in ways they hadn't been before. I noticed that he began to test boundaries subtly, to making offhand comments, small requests, hints that relied on my assumed trust. And I met each one with careful consideration, never revealing the depth of my awareness, but responding in ways that preserved control without immediate confrontation. The internal conflict within me was constant. The desire to react clashed with the need to strategize, and every moment of restraint strengthened my resolve. Late at night, I would sit quietly in the living room, replaying interactions, examining patterns, and considering next steps. The emotional pressure wasn't just about his betrayal, it was about maintaining my composure, about navigating a household where deception had quietly taken root, and about ensuring that when the moment came to act, I would do so with precision and clarity. He seemed unaware that his actions had shifted the balance of power. I could see glimpses of insecurity, small hesitations, subtle signs that he was starting to sense my awareness. But he underestimated the quiet control I had gained. I was no longer merely reacting to his behavior. I was anticipating it, understanding it, and preparing to respond in a way that would leave no room for denial or manipulation. Every day became a study in restraint and observation. I practiced responding calmly to provocations, controlling my voice, my expressions, and my timing. I allowed moments of discomfort to pass without reaction, knowing that in silence, I could gather strength. And slowly, the internal pressure I felt, anxiety, fear, betrayal, began transforming into quiet, deliberate power. Even simple tasks became opportunities to assert this subtle control. I organized our schedules, monitored routines, and managed household decisions with deliberate care. He continued to believe he held the upper hand, but the truth was, I had begun shaping the environment, guiding interactions, and determining the flow of daily life in ways he hadn't anticipated. And yet, despite this growing control, the internal conflict remained. I wrestled with love, anger, disappointment, and hope. I questioned my loyalty, my judgment, and the foundation of our marriage. Each day brought small victories, moments where I realized I could remain composed, guide situations, and assert boundaries without confrontation, but also small defeats, flashes of doubt, and reminders of how deeply the betrayal had cut. I began to see the full scope of the imbalance. For years, I had trusted, relied, and built my life around him. But now, with awareness, patience, and careful observation, the balance was shifting. He was no longer the one in control. He was being quietly observed, measured, and understood in ways he could not influence. Through it all, I maintained an outward calm, performing the routines of life, attending to responsibilities, and managing our household. But inside, I was calculating, analyzing, and preparing for the moment when the full truth would be revealed, not in anger, not in impulsive confrontation, but in deliberate clarity, backed by evidence and undeniable facts. The pressure of these weeks, the careful navigation of his manipulations, and the constant internal struggle had forged a quiet strength in me. I realized that control was not about confrontation or dominance, it was about awareness, patience, and timing. And I knew that when the turning point came, the revelation of truth would be absolute, leaving no room for lies, denial, or manipulation. By the end of that period, I felt a sense of calm determination. I had navigated deception, maintained dignity, and quietly prepared for the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. The emotional pressure, the manipulation, and the internal conflict had been exhausting, but they had also transformed me, sharpening instincts, strengthening resolve, and setting the stage for the confrontation and revelation that would ultimately reclaim clarity, honesty, and respect in my life. The day of revelation arrived quietly, without warning, yet it carried the weight of everything I had been preparing for. It began with a small, seemingly innocuous event: his laptop, left open on the dining table, a document blinking softly on the screen. I had already learned to notice these subtle openings, these tiny invitations to the truth. And something inside me told me that this was the moment I had been waiting for. I approached slowly, my heart steady, though my mind raced with anticipation. The document revealed a record of conversations, plans, and interactions that I had only glimpsed before through fleeting messages on his phone. Each line confirmed what I had suspected. but seeing it laid out in full detail, organized and deliberate, was different. This was undeniable proof, not rumors, not fleeting evidence, but concrete documentation of a life he had hidden from me. I felt a rush of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, but they were tempered by months of preparation, observation, and patience. I had rehearsed how I would confront him, imagined the questions I would ask, and the responses I might receive. Now, faced with the tangible truth, I realized that confrontation would no longer be about argument. It would be about clarity, understanding, and reclaiming the power that had been quietly taken from me. He entered the room just as I closed the document, his expression casual but alert. "What are you looking at?" he asked, though I could see the slight tension in his posture. I held the papers firmly, my voice calm but resolute. "This," I said simply, "is everything you've been hiding. All the messages, the plans, the communications. You thought I didn't notice." For a brief moment he said nothing. His eyes darted, searching for a reaction, perhaps hoping to gauge my emotional state, perhaps trying to find an escape. But there was no escape. I had observed, documented, and prepared. The power had shifted. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked quietly, not shouting, not accusing, but laying the question plainly. He swallowed, the casual fod slipping for the first time. I didn't think it mattered. It was complicated," he stammered. I shook my head slightly, incredulous. "Complicated? You made it a secret. You betrayed the trust we built over years. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it." As he struggled to respond, I presented each piece of evidence calmly, showing patterns, dates, and interactions that revealed the extent of the deception. I didn't need to embellish, to dramatize, or to plead. The truth itself was undeniable. The documents spoke louder than any argument, louder than any emotional appeal. He tried to justify, to minimize, to frame it as inconsequential. But I had anticipated these moves. I listened patiently, responding with clear, measured words, refusing to allow deflection or manipulation. Each excuse was met with fact, each rationalization countered with evidence. Slowly, the weight of the truth settled fully on him, as if he could finally see what I had seen for weeks, perhaps months. In that quiet confrontation, I realized something profound. The moment of revelation was as much about me as it was about him. I was reclaiming clarity, dignity, and control. The patience I had cultivated, the observation and documentation, the careful navigation of tension and deception, it had all led to this point. I could confront with calm authority, rather than raw emotion, and that made the truth impossible to ignore. The shift of power was subtle but complete. He no longer held the advantage of secrecy. His carefully maintained world of hidden messages and private interactions was now exposed, undeniable, and irrevocable. And in that exposure, I found a sense of empowerment that was quiet, steady, and unshakable. We sat together for hours, talking, dissecting, and understanding. There were tears from both of us, but they were not solely of sorrow. There was relief and clarity, a strange calm that comes from confronting deception and refusing to let it dominate your life. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of uncertainty lift, replaced by deliberate understanding and control. He admitted, slowly, piece by piece, the choices he had made, the motivations behind the secrecy, and the moments he had hoped would go unnoticed. I listened, absorbing everything, not to argue, not to condemn, but to fully understand the scope and intent. Knowledge, I realized, was now my ally. I could respond, plan, and decide with full awareness, no longer reacting blindly to manipulation or half-dashed truths. As the evening wore on, I recognized that this confrontation, this revelation, had fundamentally altered our relationship. The imbalance, the secrecy, and the manipulation had been addressed. The power had shifted, quietly and deliberately, and I could see that he understood it. His posture, his voice, even the careful consideration in his words, reflected the realization that the game of hidden truths was over. We began to discuss boundaries, accountability, and trust. I set expectations not from a place of anger, but from clarity. Every step forward would be deliberate, transparent, and grounded in mutual respect. And as we spoke, I realized that the months of observation, restraint, and quiet preparation had not only revealed the truth, they had also prepared both of us to navigate it constructively. By the end of that night, a profound calm had settled over our home. The revelations were clear, the documentation undeniable, and the path forward, though challenging, was illuminated. I had faced the deception with patience and clarity, reclaimed authority over my own life, and established the framework for rebuilding if he was willing to a relationship based on honesty, respect, and accountability. The documents, the evidence, and the confrontation had changed everything. But the most important transformation was internal. I had moved from shock and betrayal to calm authority, from uncertainty to deliberate control. And in that quiet empowerment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was prepared to protect my dignity, my values, and the life I had carefully built. The days after the confrontation were quieter, but the calm was not the same as before. It was a deliberate, measured calm, the kind that follows a storm, when the air is heavy with clarity and understanding rather than ignorance. I moved through the house with a sense of purpose, no longer just reacting to his presence or the remnants of betrayal, but actively shaping the environment and the life I wanted to lead. Morning routines took on a new significance. I prepared breakfast not just out of habit, but as an exercise in calm, in structure, in reclaiming normalcy. He moved around with a subdued awareness now, carefully choosing words, watching his tone, and measuring actions he had once taken for granted. The power dynamics of our household had shifted completely. I was no longer responding from a place of shock or hurt. I was responding from clarity, observation, and control. Our conversations, once dominated by surface-level topics, became intentional. I asked questions, sought honesty, and insisted on transparency. He answered, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes reluctantly, but always with recognition that the previous balance of secrecy and manipulation no longer existed. And in those moments, I realized that quiet justice does not need confrontation or spectacle. It requires steadfastness, consistency, and the refusal to allow deception to persist. I also focused on myself. For years, my attention had been centered on him, his routines, his needs, his happiness. Now, I devoted deliberate time to my own growth, reflection, and well-being. I revisited projects I had postponed, hobbies I had neglected, and plans I had shelved in service of our life together. It was a small but powerful reclaiming of agency, a way to assert that my life, my joy, and my purpose were not subordinate to his actions or mistakes. As weeks passed, I observed subtle changes in him. There was an effort, quiet but noticeable, to be accountable and transparent. He did not apologize extravagantly, nor did he try to erase the past. Instead, he acted with a measured awareness that his actions had consequences, that trust, once broken, required consistent effort to rebuild. And while I remained cautious, I could see the beginnings of respect for the boundaries I had established and the dignity I insisted on maintaining. The emotional payoff, surprisingly, came in small, almost mundane moments. A smile shared across the breakfast table felt genuine. A conversation without tension or avoidance carried a new weight of sincerity. And the simple act of completing daily responsibilities without conflict became a quiet celebration of regained equilibrium. These moments were not dramatic, not flashy, but they carried profound significance, the tangible results of patience, preparation, and steadfast self-respect. I also began mentoring myself through forgiveness, not to excuse his actions, but to free myself from the constant burden of resentment. I understood that holding on to anger would serve no one, least of all me. Forgiveness here was not reconciliation or blind trust. It was a conscious choice to move forward without allowing past betrayals to dominate my emotional life. Social interactions mirrored this internal shift. Friends and family noticed a difference not just in me, but in the way our household operated. I spoke with calm authority, no longer hesitant or reactive. He interacted with care, measured, aware that every word and action mattered. And in this quiet balance, I realized that life could continue not as it had been, not as I had naively imagined, but in a way that honored truth, accountability, and mutual respect. Over time, I recognized the subtle growth in myself as much as in him. The betrayal had forced me to confront deep vulnerabilities, question long-held assumptions, and navigate emotional complexity with deliberation and composure. I had learned to observe without judgment, act without impulsivity, and reclaim power in ways that were quiet but unshakable. My confidence, clarity, and emotional resilience had deepened, and I carried them into every aspect of life. Even the small, ordinary routines became exercises in empowerment. Preparing a meal, organizing our schedules, or managing household decisions were no longer passive acts. They were affirmations of control, patience, and deliberate action. And he, now aware of the consequences of secrecy, moved within this structure with caution and respect, gradually restoring a functional equilibrium to our home. In reflecting on the months of tension, manipulation, and eventual revelation, I realized that the true victory was not in exposing deception or in demanding accountability. It was in quietly reclaiming my life, my voice, and my agency. The moments of quiet observation, patient preparation, and deliberate confrontation had transformed the foundation of our relationship. Trust, once broken, was being rebuilt, not through dramatics or ultimatums, but through consistency, honesty, and mutual awareness. Ultimately, the greatest change was within me. I no longer allowed fear, doubt, or betrayal to dictate my reactions. I had cultivated clarity, emotional strength, and the ability to act with purpose. And in doing so, I had created a future in which I could navigate challenges with dignity, assert boundaries without hesitation, and maintain self-respect even in the face of profound disappointment. Looking back, I understood that the midnight messages were a turning point, not just in our marriage, but in my life. They forced confrontation with reality, demanded introspection, and guided me towards strength I had not fully recognized. The experience left scars, yes, but also a quiet, enduring wisdom that patience, careful observation, and deliberate action can reclaim agency even in the most painful circumstances. And as I moved forward, watching the days settle into a rhythm of honesty and accountability, I felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. The deception had not defined me. Instead, my response, my patience, and my clarity had transformed both my own life and the dynamic of our relationship. I had endured, observed, and acted, and in doing so, I had quietly reclaimed justice, dignity, and the power to shape my own future.